Hello, and welcome to the Writers and Illustrators of the Future podcast. This is John Goodwin, your host. This podcast is dedicated to the aspiring writer and artist and will provide inspiration and tips from top professionals in the field. If you've been listening to this podcast or are new to it, I thank you very much. I would also appreciate if you took a moment to follow it on whatever platform you use to listen to your podcasts. Writers of the Future is one of the longest running writing competitions in the world, now celebrating 4 decades of providing a helping hand as initially conceived by L. Ron Hubbard. I also want to let you know that Writers of the Future volumes are available in bookstores throughout the US, Canada, the UK, South Africa, and Australia, as well as through all major online retailers. We're here at the Writers and Illustrators of the Future workshop in Hollywood, California. Today's guest is Bill Fawcett, who I've had on this podcast a few years ago. Bill has been a professor, teacher, corporate executive, and college dean. His entire life has been spent in the creative fields and managing other creative individuals. He's one of the founders of Mayfair Games, a board and role-playing company. As an author, Fawcett has written or co-authored over a dozen books and dozens of articles. Actually, at least it's one more because we're going to be talking about his next one. And dozens of articles and short stories. As a book packager, a person who prepares series of books from concept to production for major publishers, his company, Bill Fawcett Associates, has packaged more than 250. So whatever's up to now, it's still more than 250 titles for virtually, 400, he just let me know. Has packaged more than 400 titles for virtually every major publisher. And yes, I agree. You should get your bio updated because you're just like way too fast for the internet here. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Fun to be here.
Yeah. So I just went through a whole bunch of stuff that you are. So I want to be able to, first off, for the listeners, because the podcast has grown quite a bit since we did our interview last. Just a bit about yourself and your history, how you've moved up the ranks and why everybody should be so excited to listen to this interview.
I'm excited. Oh, thank you.
That's my part to make that happen. You can talk about what you've done so I can then justify why I'm saying
this. No pressure at all, John. Thank you. All right. After working in training to be a teacher and then a dean and working in those areas, I moved into commercial and business education and training. I was a senior training director for a couple of major insurance companies and things like that, and created simulations for them and such. That got me into the gaming aspect, which had always been something I'd been interested in. And I just happened to live near Lake Geneva when Dungeons and Dragons started. So I got involved with that and got more involved with the gaming. And eventually I had to make a choice between being well paid in insurance or barely making it in gaming. So I made the obvious choice. I went to gaming and started Mayfair Games with a couple of partners and we've never been regretting it since. It was a wonderful thing. It moved me totally into the world of creativity and working with imaginative people and writers and all sorts of wonderful interrelationships. And I went from that after years. Mayfair, my job was working with the publishers who were putting our product out, Berkeley, in this case, Berkeley Publishing, where I got to know the writers and the editors and the salespeople in the book industry. And so I got tricked into writing a couple of books by one of the editors once. And that sort of started me on my writing career as well. I was dating an editor. She needed work out of her. So she asked me to review a book so that the editor could work and I would be busy doing this. book. And I realized later it was terrible on purpose.
Oh,
And the editor gave it to me to just write what was wrong with it for her so she could give it to the author. And then I came in and I said, why did you give this to me? It's terrible. You guys are publishing everything with an elf and a unicorn in it. And she said, I've done better in my gaming design stuff. And she said, glad to hear you say that. Here's a 2-book contract. Start writing. And she got the editor to work that weekend because I was distracted. So it worked out quite well. And that started me off by mistake or by a trick. And I've always thanked her for tricking me. And I went from that into working with other writers and putting together, book packaging was getting an idea of a concept. Convincing a publisher it was a good idea, getting some writers who would write it, creating the world, creating the outlines, working with the writers to get the books done, looking over the books to make sure the contents were good, editing them in effect, and then turning them into the publisher and keeping a little of the money in the middle so that I could, like eat or feed my new wife at the time, who's your chief judge now.
I'm glad you fed her.
Oh, yeah. Chocolate.
Yes.
And so eventually that evolved into a rather full-time business. In fact, I went into it to finance my writing, but I got subdued by the monetary side of the force and ended up doing that for about 20 years and doing many books. But it gave me the opportunity to work with so many great writers, many of whom are judges now here. Catherine and everyone, Scott Card, all these people, work on books with them. And eventually I've gotten back again now to writing and doing my own books as I decided to working with writers is wonderful. It's rewarding. They're creative. They're interesting. They have no concept of what a deadline is whatsoever. Very few do. And so it can also be aggravating, frustrating, and exciting. It's herding very creative cats.
Yeah.
And as a result, I'm sort of calming down on that and just working with a few friends now and starting to write again on my own as I get up there to get some of those books I promised myself I'd write in the 80s done in the thousands.
Good. So we'll use that as a bridge here over to talking about your book that's just now releasing. The title is called Never Again by Bill Fawcett. And probably the one genre that scares me the most is near future military science fiction, because that what if is so couched in reality that to be able to see the difference between what's current, what's real, and what is the imagination, what's the speculative versus the actual. And so you got stuff in there because it's so near future, and you've taken it and you've put it in a battlefield that's not here in America, but it's near, and it's because of what's happening right now in the world with the Middle East constantly feuding and fighting. And you also have these big tycoons that want to finance, the big companies that finance mercenaries and they finance high-tech stuff, and then put it all together in this book here. It's like, all right, so I want to talk to him about which is his imagination and which is stuff that you've been privy to, and which is the stuff that you've been privy to you can't say you've been privy to, but nevertheless it's in
and
there.
You want me to talk about that? Thank you.
I'm going to be able to, by isolating both other points there, that leaves that part there for one's desire to read the book to find out what's he talking about.
There goes my clearance. All right. The book itself is set indeterminate period in the near future. And it's in
you use year 9, year 1, years.
This is the year since the establishment of a Kurdish republic.
Right.
Yeah, like the Roman Empire did it by emperor, the 4th year of Hadrian's reign, etc. And so in this book, so that I don't have the normal problem science fiction writers have when they write 1984 or in 2023, this goes, Arthur C. Clarke, 2001 was exciting in 1980 or 70, but in 2024, it's a little while ago now, and we're still not out there, and Hal still hasn't locked us out.
Exactly.
But this is in the near future, and it's dated that way to avoid it. And it assumes just two things that are different from reality, and the rest of it is totally based on reality and intelligence and history. I am a historian. I've written a number of books about mistakes in history and things like that.
Very fun ones too, like you would not believe. But anyway,
well, if you can't have fun with history, I mean, you might as well just start crying now, because we're making it.
I know.
And so this book is set that the one people in the world that have been more abused than probably any other group but American Indians in some degree are the Kurds. They fought the British so well, the British wouldn't give them a country when they broke up the Middle East. They divided the Kurdish-speaking, the Kurdish cultural people into 5 different countries or locations on the edges of everything instead of being in the center. Northern Iraq, Northern Iran, Eastern Syria, Kurdistan, a little South Iraq. All those areas had a strong Kurdish and still have a Kurdish-speaking population, and they have fought intensively and hard to maintain their culture and their awareness of a people. I assume that they finally succeed in not being just an autonomous region, and the fact that they occupied a good portion of Syria, which, by the way, they still do, because they were the people who did the fighting against Daesh, against the Arab Caliphate, ISIS.
Okay, got it.
That they were the bulk of the people that fought them and fought them. They're very good warriors. Our army, called the Peshmerga, has been a cultural militia local for centuries. It goes back to a tradition. Saladin was a Kurd, the great leader that fought Richard the Lionheart. And they go back to their people basically fighting Alexander to a dead still and saying, all right, we'll just unite with you instead. Roxanne was just what we would call today a Kurd. The part of Kurdish people were that city-state that Alexander's favorite wife came from. I say favorite because cultures were a little different, and he sort of had a collection. Anyhow, so I assume in this book that they've actually formed their nation, and they've put that fanaticism, that energetic sense of nation and sacrifice to work in creating one. And we're about 9 years in. And at the same time, Iran, under pressure of its own incompetence and mullahs and stuff, is collapsing. So a rich nation, which is growing, sort of a Hong Kong model or an Israel model of modern and democracy and everything, in the middle of all these countries that have all these repressive dictators, is what you call a target. So the one thing is, I took the Kurdish people and gave them a country.
Right.
And probably made them a little more ideal and self-sacrificing than any large people are. But nonetheless, they very much are very close to that. I've talked to a number of people who came out of various branches of our military and special forces and trained the Kurds, who have been our allies very often. And they have great admiration for the Kurdish people. Not necessarily their politicians. That's also reflected in the books.
Oh, man, he's like a serious piece of work.
But
Hassan, right?
No, Hassan is Iraq. Oh, Hassan in here. Oh, yeah, the president.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, you've read the book.
Yeah.
Hassan, the president, is, let's just say,
he qualifies with what you just said for there. You need to read the book to really know what a piece of work he is.
If he was in America, he'd be governor of Mississippi. But
okay.
and or maybe mayor of New Orleans, even better.
Yeah.
Kind of self-serving and corrupt. Anyhow, and I say that coming from Chicago, which is impressive. The other suspension of disbelief is that just one, batteries. Now, you'd think the power to armor would be a suspension of disbelief, but with the exception of the development of a small battery that can produce tremendous amounts of power, everything else is technology off the shelf today. Everything else in that part of the book. And I take the battery.
Rail guns?
Well, if you have enough power, you can do it.
Wow.
The limitation on the railgun is generating the power and putting it into place. So yes, possibly the fact that they're firing a railgun while standing is also fiction, since it probably should drive them 30 feet back. It is not a it has a reaction. There's a lot of force there, since it's sending out something that'll penetrate armor.
Yeah.
But other than that, batteries. We haven't had a development since the lithium battery 15 years ago. I mean, if they were developing like, say, the components of our phones, the electronics in our phones, we should have a battery the size of my thumbnail that could run a car at this point in the same progressive development.
Where's the dilithium crystals?
Yes,
when you
we need
them?
our dilithium crystals. Absolutely. Well, since we haven't gotten into space, we haven't found planets with dilithium yet. And but we presuppose a brilliant scientist who likes it in the Kurdish nation, Kurdish Republic, and develops this battery.
Right.
And so what they have is basically the suit similar to the super soldier suit developed by DARPA. In fact, I even have
That's what
DARPA
it is.
deliver it to them.
It comes from them because they canceled production,
which they
because
have
of the battery problem.
Yeah, which they have. I mean, we have this suit. You can run 20 miles an hour. You can lift 400 pounds. You can jump to 8 feet, and it moves with great strength. You can carry a 100-pound weapon load and stuff like that.
As long as you have a long enough extension cord.
Absolutely. You stole my great line. But you need a very long extension cord because it sucks power in a truck with a whole generator on it hooked to that extension cord. So we that's our suspension of belief. We took that away. Now, if you take a look at today's situation, let's be honest, I wrote this because it was really satisfying to create somebody to beat the Iranians up.
Okay.
It's a very satisfying read on that level because the good guys are righteous and the bad guys are the ones what we're dealing with right now in almost every case.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm going to put someone who's going to clean house up, it's in the Mideast.
Right.
So they clean house in the Mideast. And in this first book, the suits are just being developed and there aren't a lot of them, and they have to deal with a massive last-ditch Iranian invasion of their much smaller nation and army in order to save it and use the suits in a very different way than just facing the enemy. They have to find tactical ways, and they have to accept a lot of sacrifices, the people wearing them.
Right. But it's also, it reinvents modern warfare with this too.
Yes, and it brings back Mongolian warfare because what we have created is highly mobile, heavily armed light horsemen in suits instead of on horses. So many of the tactics that was used by the Mongols from that part of the world, not there, but the Mongolian steppes, obviously, work again for the powered suits as far as flanking and falling back and all that. And I actually steal a few, you historians look for which battles I steal from the Great Mongol invasions. And so they have many of the same advantages and disadvantages. There's a lot of problems wearing a power suit. First of all, something heavy caliber is still going to penetrate it.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, if you fire one of those rail guns, it locks up. You've got to lock up, brace your legs, and not get thrown back so you can target. And then, which is almost as bad as old wire-guided missiles used to be, where you had to stand up and keep the tank in the thing in your eye until it hit it, which led to a lot of dead missile shooters.
Yeah.
And then finally, if you're wearing a power suit around you that's made out of metal and padding for 2 or 3 days in combat, have you any idea how much that itches? That would be incredibly uncomfortable, and I wouldn't want to be at any of the joints where it's rubbing.
Yeah.
So there's some real disadvantage, and we deal with the sort of real world of that with a lot of exciting scenes. And very honestly, I like battles in books. I count how many car chases and explosions in a movie to decide if I like it. So this book is, in fact, the whole series, there'll be 4 books, center around the battle and the things related to the battle, such as the politics and the leadership, etc.
Yeah, I really like although he has a name, he's a colonel, he gets promoted up to general. He's a field promotion because his mentor is toasted. So he gets called back, and he's got a very strong sense of loyalty. It was really remind me in several ways, because sometimes I like to compare to earlier stuff, and I'm very familiar with all of Hubbard's works, where he had a character, the lieutenant, in Final Blackout. And he's just, this guy, never again. And he had experienced something that nobody should ever have to experience it. Opening up that sets the pace for his mentality on becoming a general and leading his.
Oh, very much so. You to have something like this, whether it's Final Blackout or even Battlefield Earth, you need a character who has lost,
Yeah.
who has suffered, and who it molds him and makes him something. In this case, it makes him, when he loses his family, I hate to give that away, but he suffers great losses, mentor family, many things, and he reattaches his loyalty to his whole nation, and
Yeah.
and the people in the nation under pressure accept this and join him in it. Hence the thing, never again can they do to us what they have done. Kurds have some great phrases. Only the mountains are our friends. I mean, all military. And so you have this concept, as in the Hubbard books and others, of someone molded by their environment, who is the leader, who leads them in an impossible situation, like an Earth that's been occupied for so long, and takes it back and succeeds against the odds. And this is very much David and Goliath.
Yeah. No, it's so that's why I was able to, just at a time when I need more sleep, I wasn't able to.
Well, I do cheat. I stole Dan Brown's writing style. Every chapter ends with a cliffhanger, so you can't stop.
I know.
It's cruel and unusual punishment, but it makes for a good read.
It is definitely a great read. So again, the book is called Never Again by Bill Fawcett, and it's going to be available.
It is available.
It is available
on Amazon now.
Okay, good. So on Amazon. So
and an Audible.
Oh, good. The audiobook. Oh, that's good news. So we'll probably touch on this one more time at the end of this, but now that I've done my due diligence.
Thank you for the plug.
Yes. Now I want to talk about your expertise with everything that I covered in the intro. Now that we're here at the 40th anniversary for Writers of the Future, your lovely wife is the coordinating judge and has been for a few years. We originally met at Dragon Con 10 years ago, 8 years ago?
About 10 years ago,
yeah.
Yes.
And which is a convention that obviously you've been connected with since
about 30 years.
About 30 years? Yeah, I originally started going to Dragon Con shortly after it started in the late 80s, and met Pat. And this has been, Dragon Con is probably one of the best conventions in America. I don't do particularly science fiction and fantasy conventions anywhere else outside Canada, but the whole mentality that was created for and to maintain was that earlier science fiction community of fandom, where people they were able to meet in a coffee shop. They could meet in some place that's just really comfortable and you can just talk. It's not a big convention center like you've got normally, like San Diego Comic-Con or other conventions.
There are many kinds of conventions, and there are fan conventions, and we are the largest fan-run convention. We're all fans and volunteers. There are literally 3 employees who have to do the paperwork because of our size, and that's it. Everyone else is a volunteer, even. And we make enough to do next year's convention, basically. And so we keep the prices down. But the idea of it was, as we evolved, and it started as one of many conventions at its time 40 years ago. And what we saw the need for was the fact that there are comic conventions, there are movie conventions, there were Star Trek conventions. There was no convention that had a little of comics and everything else you want. So we went, and I've always went for not only a diversity of fans, but a diversity of activities. So we have over 3,000 events now. There's about 70,000 attendees in Atlanta on Labor Day. And the idea is to basically have something that everyone, from your children to the most hardest core, we have the War College runs a session at it. We have the Robot Wars. We have guys in full armor with full contact combat for international competition at it. We also have panels on, I think, 11 different literary topics and about 10 others running constantly that you can find your favorite author. You can find that. Our cosplay has become very known, and we have not 1, but 4 masquerades contests.
You also have one of the biggest or best, or one of the last remaining art shows, and that's something that it's so unfortunate that that one part of conventions has been sloughed off to where you've got either only the art dedicated shows like Gen Con or something like that, but otherwise Dragon Con is the last great art show that people can come.
Dirty secret: you don't make money on an art show. It doesn't help support the con.
For sure, but
But
boy,
we are dedicated. We are fanatic about, we want it all there. We want it, the experience to be, and a great art show with lots of different things in it, along with the comic section, comic art section, and everything else, Comic Row, we think a vital part of the experience. And it also, of course, is an outlet for artists, for people to find artists they like, people to sell paintings at it. You can go there and get the most amazing paintings at, compared to a gallery, pittance, really, because the artist is just like when you buy directly from the person who made the coat in South America, and it costs a lot less. The art from the artist is a lot less expensive than the gallery who takes a big markup.
Yeah, no, it's just amazing on this thing. We've got several Illustrators of the Future winners that are there. You even have the largest blood drive within a science fiction and fantasy convention community. There's only one blood drive that's bigger, which is not science fiction and fantasy. It's I forget which one it is, but it's the second largest one in the United States, and you get like over 3,000 pints of blood that's donated.
Pints, platelets,
Yeah.
yes, it approaches 3,000 every year. In that, it is incredibly gratifying. Our fans are the most amazing people. Our attendees, we're a family, and we think that way, and that's sort of the different attitude too. No offense to Comic Cons, but some of the Comic Cons are simply find a way to extract money.
Yeah,
we even keep our attendance costs down compared to other conventions.
No, you guys, you work against what you need to make to have next year, and that's
and our attendees will line up for an hour to give blood in the middle of a con with 3,000 events. They're standing in that line for an hour to get in and donate. And it's incredibly gratifying, and it's the largest in the Southeast and the second largest that I know of.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so and
I've
very
donated
proud
thousands of books. As you know, if somebody donates blood, they get a, because you got the things you get.
They look for your skid now when they come out.
Yeah.
You got to. Oh, by the way, you're starting to repeat some of the books, and some of them have given so many years. They say, "I've got this already." Just mentioning that.
Okay, good.
Seriously, the Writers of the Future, the press has been. Galaxy Press has been incredibly generous in its support of it. You've had a skid of books out there for everyone who donates, and invariably it goes away for our about 2,500 donees, basically, to do pick one up as they go, and a lot do. So it's appreciated. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. It's just, it contributes. And it's also based on the fact that, because it's the Heinlein blood drive, and Heinlein and Hubbard were best buds when they were, in the Pulp Fiction days. So,
and after Robert's operation, they found out that Robert Heinlein's artery to his brain was clogged, and he almost died from it. And he was cloudy thinking, he wasn't getting enough oxygen, and he was unconscious. And they figured out what it was, and they basically roto-rooted his artery, and it opened up. And that led, of course, to his great discovery. When Robert Heinlein began to fade, he was halfway done, had done a rough draft of a book called Number of the Beast. When it looked like he wasn't going to live, the publisher put it out to put out his last work. Practically the first words when Robert Heinlein was conscious again was, "You printed what?" And I'm sure he and L. Ron Hubbard had quite a discussion of publishers at that point.
Yeah. So, like I said, I'm like a total fan of Dragon Con, but that's just one of the Fawcett facets, that okay, that was cheesy, but anyway, I'm using it as my bridge now over to the next aspect of this interview. So when we talked before, we talked about the many impending deaths of publishing, and we're now moving into, or have moved into, self and indie publishing as a major resource. It's interesting that I'm here at the Rise of the Future, and we got all these different judges, and we got some that are like, stalwarts for traditional is the only way and stick with it and don't buy into the stuff. And
Legacy
others,
publishers, yes.
yes. And others are like, the publishing of the future is self and indie, and there's more people making their seven-digit, income annually from being self and indie publishing.
7-digit.
Seven figure. Okay. Yes.
Not me. Not many, but there are a few, and it can be done. But I've been in the business about 50 years. Yeah, I'm old. You should see all the gray hair in this room. And I think I've heard about before or witnessed at least the 4 or 5 predicted deaths of publishing during my career, maybe more. It started in the 30s when the cost of materials went up for the first time. Paper got more expensive. It was because of World War II. And so they cut. Do you realize in 1935, a writer got 35% of the cover of the book? And then they started cutting it back because the expenses were higher. And when it went to 25%, by the way, for your interest, today it's 10 if you really do well, 15 when it sells a lot of copies.
Right.
Okay. So when it went from 30 to 25, very well-known and very popular, Bernard Cerf, the comic writer, said, "This is the end of publishing. No one can live as a writer anymore. They'll starve to death," which would have come as a shock to Stephen King 50 years later. But in any case, so that was a predicted end as expenses changed and the writer got less because the publisher didn't have as much, because publishing is not a big profit margin industry. Right. It's about 3 to 5%. Well, you run Galaxy Press. You're painfully aware of that fact. Yeah. And you don't make that much on every book, so returns hurt. And so they thought that, this was the end of it all because they'd do nothing but reprints from then on. Then you get into the 50s and pocketbooks created the pocketbook. And this was definitely because you didn't have to return them. They were being pulped. This was the end of publishing as we know it. No one could make any money. The industry was doomed with this horrible, trashy production, which within 3 years, every publisher was putting out millions of. And the paperback was going to destroy publishing. Then I got up into the 70s and the collapse of the bookstores in the 80s. This combined with, and another completely separate prediction was the first ebooks, which, by the way, weren't successful. The first ebook companies were a disaster. People lost fortunes. There was no good way to do it. The internet wasn't strong enough. You were, you're still dialing, waiting for it to make a noise and connect to you. It was, if I had a 6 baud connection, that's 6K a second, people. It was great. And it cost by about $130 in their money back then from Bell at the time too. Anyhow, so they were sure the ebook would destroy publishing because authors would simply sell directly. They hadn't quite figured out how, but they predicted that. And that prediction was 30 years of talking. And every time I turned around and ebooks got more popular, publishing was doomed. The other one was as the bookstore chains sort of imploded from overexpansion and correcting each other when Brookstone went down. Everyone predicted that publishing could not survive such a hit, that it would be an absolute total loss. And so it's gone. It was supposed to be gone. But somehow Amazon came along and we survived. But of course, everyone knows that about 2005, Amazon was being condemned heartily because it had destroyed modern publishing and all the publishers would be out of business and there'd only be Amazon in 5 years. I read that more than once in many places. Mm-hmm. So, the industry has been doomed so many times that I've lived through the death of publishing 7 times there now. And we're still here. Yeah. Now, legacy publishing is still trying to find its feet in the modern era. And they have turned to a Hollywood model, the bestsellers. They want big bestseller books. They used to foster new talent. When I started in an industry, we looked for new writers and we were excited because we could build them up over 3 or 4 books. Because a publisher loses money on your first few books. And so they're going to build them up and get people to buy their books later on and have their whole library for sale, etc. Today, that's gone. They instead of an editor picking good talent, they have a committee of 12 deciding what they can market the best. And that's the books you see from the legacy publishers. It left a big gap. So the small independent publishers went from tiny garage operations at 4 books a year, and the medium publishers like you began to expand and fill this void left by. And your Galaxy Press for you guys sort of straddles the border of that. You're in a way a specialty house, and in a way a major publisher. Shame on you. So I've always tried to figure that out. And when you have an identity, let me know.
Okay, good.
And so the indie came in, and the big advantage an indie publisher has is my deal on this current book. I can't give the exact percentage, but let's just say it's about 5 times what I would get from a legacy publisher in percentage.
Yeah.
Because I am a partner with the publisher rather than an employee, a contract employee, like the major publishers think. And until you get big enough to negotiate those $1 million contracts, and even they aren't what they used to be. When I was working with agents, I did subsidiary rights for a while. One of the clients was Stephen King, and I was there when they signed an $8 million book, multi-book contract with him when he was really hot. Now he gets about $2 million a book, and the money's changed. Why? Because they don't do advances like that anymore, because it's all changed.
Right.
He's still one of the top paid authors in the country, and deservedly so, but it's all changed. Well, these indie publishers, the cooperative groups have grown to fill that void, so that today almost half the books sold are from non-legacy publishers. And about 40% of the money going into books are non-legacy publishers. And the amount of titles, about 70% of them are non-legacy publishers.
Right.
So the world has changed, and authors have to look around and adjust. And unlike legacy publishers, indies very rarely have a promotion department. So suddenly you're paying for ads on Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got one of the people I was referring to on the near future military science fiction that just scares the bejesus out of me was an author named James Rassone. He's strictly Amazon, and he's making 7 figures.
There are several doing that.
Yeah.
Paltrow too.
Yeah. And so forth. And we've got Dean Wesley Smith and Mark Leslie Lefebvre have talked about indie and helping a lot of that. And you've also got now the ability to do Kickstarters so that you can fund your project before publishing, so that you at least have broken even. And then if you make any of the next levels up in your Kickstarter, then you're into a profit range. But that way you're going into publishing without that risk of losing money. Minimally, you'll break even.
Absolutely. And that's the result of 2 things. Not only the rise of, and there are multiple sites that are Kickstarter sites,
right,
but also technology has advanced. When I started, and when you started in this business, they were still slugging with lead print, and you were reading the page proofs, and they had been kiking off that. And today it's push of a button, and it's all electronic, and it's changed. And it used to be 1,000 book minimum, 10,000 optimal.
Yeah.
For the number of books. And today you can run 50 books with the ease that you could run 5,000 less than 25 years ago. Technology has changed dramatically, so that Amazon can do print on demand. There are no Amazon warehouses of books, just fat computers and printers. They spew them out and dump them in the envelope.
I know, it's amazing how that works. And you've got also there's so many of the draft to digital is one of the examples, because that's one of the ones that Mark Leslie helped create. But you've also got the other things they've got there. You've got like the Amazon Kindle, there's draft to digital, there's Ingram Spark, there's Lulu, and then you've got like the WMG, which is what Dean has as his company, which I learned WMG are the first initial of his 3 cats, and then Wordfire with Kevin Anderson.
Did you know Kevin's last 3 books were Kickstarters? And I was saying, how did it go? And he said, I've gotten 3 times as much from the Kickstarter as advances from publishers. So he's a believer. Sold on it now.
Yeah, he's a believer. And he started his publishing house because, like you were saying, the traditional publishers, they have to keep them moving on. They're not going to keep stuff in print. But if they have the rights to it, you're like, sucks. So he worked on getting the rights back. He created his own publishing house so he could keep his books going. One thing I definitely know is each generation, if you got a good book, you've got audience for there. So Battlefield Earth, which is now 5 million copies or so that it sold. Each generation, when I go to Dragon Con, I'm there. You either got a grandfather or a father coming and saying, get that book. Or somebody just walks in, that's a great book, and just you get the audience themselves will help push it. And so that's an advantage of being able to have the rights yourself. You can keep it in print. And that's the whole thing too, that 20 books to 50K, that whole thing Craig Martell helped to create, is if you have books out there.
If you have a library,
you have a library yourself. I read this book, Never Again. Oh, this is amazing. What else has he written? If you've got a library, you've just sold a bunch more books.
Yeah, and you, when you're not doing anything else, dump them all on Kindle Unlimited and get paid per page.
Yeah,
it's not much per page, but then there's millions of people that are members. So that's also changed everything about what books go out there. And a lot of people that you're talking, including the people you quoted, are on Kindle Unlimited, and they have 50 or 100 books on it. And what it does do is encourage writing fast. A lot of these writers are putting out 4 or 5 or 6 books a year,
which you can't do with traditional.
Well, it takes 18 months for the book come out after you finish it.
Yeah.
You can do that many, but they won't take that many books from you.
Right.
And they never could. Piers Anthony, the famous author, used to write under 3 different pseudonyms because he wrote fast, and the publishers would pay you less if you offered them too many books.
Well, that was the problem that Hubbard had with the pulps. Some of the magazines had multiple stories under different names.
Yes,
because there weren't enough.
He was so prolific. His action adventure stories, which were always fun. I remember reading them as a boy. They came out in the 50s and 60s when I was reading that. I shows you this is a really old man here. You get them, and of course I didn't recognize style, but I knew good stories, and he'd be in Men's Adventure or True, or some of these 2 or 3 times in an issue. But then I think that was a side effect of he was paid by the word, and he had to make a living.
Yeah, and he was one of the highest paid authors for that. And I've had over the course of this week here, I've discussed with other authors too. Dean Wesley Smith is very familiar with Owen Hubbard because he wanted to be able to emulate him as an author, because he's a very high output, author as well. But he does really well with this thing. He makes a lot of money in his Kickstarters. He does 6 a year, and he talks about, and he works out. He did that whole. There's that one article Owen Hubbard wrote on the business, where he gets into the business of writing and work out what different areas make you the most money for your efforts. And he says, the number one thing for him is rights. He says, I get more money in rights. That's the top income source for me. And then he gets into his Kickstarters, is number 2 that he does. And he just broke it down 6 different ways he makes money on his intellectual property. And
do you realize we went from people are talking about the end of publishing to talking about dozens of success stories here and how people are making really good money at it again? We are selling more books today. Well, whether it's Hubbard or Heinlein or anyone from the past or new writers than ever in history. Publishing is not dying. Publishing is growing, but it's having growth pains. That's what's going on again.
Yeah, I had this in 2023. There was an article written by Nicholas Rizzola. He says the need to help aspiring. There are upwards of 4 million books published each year, with 75% being self-published, roughly 3 million. The sad fact is that the average self-published author makes $1,000 annually, selling only 250 copies, and that's from a book on self-published books and author sales statistics. But the point on that is, and this is also I wanted to be able to address, like this podcast, Writers of the Future, and the value of having something like this to give you that leg up on making sure you're not one of those $1,000 a year published authors, but you're actually can get yourself known, recognized, and rise above all the din of out there.
One of the biggest problems in publishing today is determining which books are good before you buy them.
Yeah.
And just because you knew from a legacy publisher, it had been screened by experts and still is.
Right.
But with the thousands of independent publisher books, some are good, some are from authors who shouldn't be publishing.
Right.
And the contest, Writers of the Future, provides one of the tools to say, Writers of the Future winner on the cover. Okay, we know this guy can write.
Right.
If I buy this book, I'm not going to be disappointed. So that's a very valuable thing that you're providing in what is still a very amorphous, growing field of people trying to determine just what is what. Because even, and Amazon will hate me, but even all the Amazon Unlimited books aren't good. I have that. I like to see what they're doing. I read perhaps 2/3 of what I pick up. I get 50 pages into some and go, nope. He had the hero do something stupid to keep the plot going, or it's just not well written, or my God, this is a cliche, and it goes away.
Well, I hate reading books too, where all of a sudden they're trying to sell me their philosophy. Like I love epic fantasy stuff, but then it's I've got one right now which I just can't finish. I try, and I'm really trying, and he's trying to sell what he wants to read with his stuff, and I can't do that. I read a story for story, not for somebody to sell me on their.
I want philosophy. I'll watch CNN. I want to escape.
Yeah.
When I wrote Never Again, I wrote it because it would be a fun read, because it's a page turner with a lot of events, a lot of explosions, and a lot of heroes and anti-heroes.
Yeah.
And that was not a mistake. It has absolutely no philosophy and very little politics in it. And the only politics are in the Kurdish Republic because of some evil politicians. Come on. We all like beating on evil politicians. There are some very good ones that I admire greatly too, but there are some self-serving people out there,
Yeah.
and they're fun to make a villain out of.
Yeah. That's something you can do with science fiction too. That probably better than any other genre. You can do what you just said right there. It's cautionary tales, and which is what other countries had to do, where it was such heavily suppressed. Like even in Russia, that with science fiction, you could put another planet, another society, another thing. Then you could talk about.
It gives some freedom. China, Russia, even today, it's got more freedom than their normal literature.
Yeah.
Although still, there were this unfortunate side effect of our success as a genre, and we succeeded. When I was in high school in the early '60s, I was a nerd and didn't call it that back then.
Right.
I was what today would be a nerd, and there were a dozen of us who read science fiction books out of a couple of thousand students. And we found each other sometimes, and sometimes we just read everything with a rocket ship on the back. And I've watched over time, first D&D popularizing fantasy, and then the Tolkien surge, and then all the movies and the comics going from comic books to the video to the movies. And I have enjoyed living, as I explained to people, we've won.
Yep.
I did an interview. I do nonfiction history, and we were doing interviews with Navy SEALs for the History of the Navy SEALs television show and book series. And there was this grizzled old master chief. Had to be in his 50s. This is about 20 years ago. He was talking about, and he pulled into a village in Iraq, I think in this case, and there was a wall, and then there was a big dune next to the village. And as soon as they pulled in, they started taking fire. And he said, well, and he looked at us and said, I looked at how many there were up there and decided we didn't have enough hit points to take them on in combat. So I called in an airstrike, and I went, hit points? A 50-year-old master chief who's been military all his life just described his unit in hit points like D&D. We've won. And we've become a part of the culture. And the side effect of that is the undemocratic administrations, the dictatorial, the repressive administrations are afraid of us now.
Yeah.
So
you get
good
people
for us.
You get people to think and go, wait a minute, I don't have to have like this, and look at this, and they did it there, so maybe we can do it here.
Yeah, good for us. Just as the heroic actions of the characters in Hubbard or Heinlein or Asimov or Reynolds or any of those old classic writers inspired us to be what we are, we're hopefully creating the next generation of out of the box thinking rebels with our books.
Yeah. One thing that we got our last 10 minutes here, and one area I just realized would be maybe might explore a bit here is when I was talking with Dean Wesley Smith, we were talking about, pulp fiction, and he said now it's almost like a renaissance of that pulp writing. It's raw. There's what you've got the ability, and a lot of the pulp fiction was garbage, but a lot of it was really good, and it was the forefather of what we're reading right now in science fiction and fantasy, and those are some seriously big shoulders that today's genre is built upon. But because of the ability to put so much out so fast, it's almost like pulps, except instead of on pulpwood paper, it's, you've got your phone and I can just download and I'd have to read a lot for this podcast, but it's great. I just go through, I have so many books on here and I can just it's a Kindle Unlimited. You have 5 or 10 books in a given time you can download for free. It's 8. So I just keep on rotating the books I got downloaded and I read them and put them back.
The trick is to get the series because they count as one book.
Oh, really?
And you get the 5-book series all together, normally because the books are about 40,000 words long, as it turns out.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, and that's pulp fiction again.
Exactly.
And we have re-evolved into a market of people reading more, looking for something that's just fun with continuing story.
Yeah.
Flash Gordon has come back. Would come back. If Flash Gordon had started today, he'd work.
Yeah.
And we have the equivalent of that from some of the most successful Amazon Unlimited and other writers who are doing this 20 will get you 50 because it builds fandom and it gives you something familiar, and you aren't looking for great literature. You're looking for a good fight scene. And we evolved into this. Actually, we sucked up another genre, whether you realize it or not. But 35 years ago, right, there was a pulp genre, but it was The Enforcer and The Destroyer, and it was I
read almost every one of those Destroyers.
All those books, all the Gold Eagle. I love Chewin and Mac and everything. And
the Golden Arches.
Well, they aren't there anymore, really. They aren't because we have taken over that slot with the science fiction version of it, and that's what today's generation is reading. That hard-edged, hard-eyed military guy or martial artist is gone in the books effectively. And instead we have the blaster and the ship and the sarcastic commenting hero of Firefly in that level, which really, if you think about Firefly, is simply pulp westerns in space anyhow, which is what Joe said it was when I asked him.
Yeah. So I think it's an interesting thing because you also have one thing that makes it work for me is it's gone back to being escapist literature. Some of this stuff here, which was in the pulp fiction, because in pulp fiction, you had World War I had ended, you had the crash of Wall Street, and so half of America was out of work. There was a threat of World War II because it was happening in Europe, but it hadn't come here yet. And so people were really afraid. And you could you could read a book, which is what I like about it. You could read a book and it could transport you someplace else for that time that you're reading it. And you can just kind of and what made authors like Hubbard so successful is he had a storyline, which Heinlein referred to. I learned there's a new storyline, and that's The Man That Learned Better. And so he'd have the everyday Joe was doing something he wasn't necessarily heroic, and he definitely wasn't necessarily always doing on the right side of the law, but he'd come to some moral crossroads and he decided to do the right thing, and people could identify with that, and it was something that was needed to kind of help egg them on to, okay, let's continue on. And you got that now.
Absolutely. It never is there more need for release from. And if you think pulp fiction is popular now, wait until the election gets more intense so you can't watch television at all. But anyhow,
I know. I mean, it's crazy. It's so divisive. So having something like science fiction as well to kind of let's chill people. Let's just chill. And you get into the social media and all this stuff here. It gets so gnarly.
And the nice part is that we're getting into genre reading again.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure you're finding that if you reprint some of the better of the pulp stories, you can find a market for them again.
I
There's
do.
a lot of interest, and it's working on many levels. It it worked in the 50s when there was the tension. We're all going to die in nuclear war. I remember bending over and ducking,
Oh,
covering in
totally duck,
school.
cover, and hold. And the
And
sirens going, the sirens in the street.
Mickey Spillane, Mad Helm, all those are the release in those days.
Yeah.
Today we're going back and reading, not necessarily those because they got pretty dated because of the cultural aspects, but you go back to the 30s and we're all familiar with that in the 40s, and we're really comfortable with their pulp along with modern pulp, which bears a striking resemblance to it, to the point where if you want to show somebody in the future, you put them in a 1932 haircut, especially the women. They all look like they came out of Vogue magazine in 1932 with the funny hair and everything. And that's futuristic, huh?
Yeah.
So, yeah, pulp is exciting, and it's a growing market because of the Kindle Unlimited and the other small publishers putting out those books in small numbers or large numbers that are done quickly. And it's also meant pulp doesn't hold up for 120,000 words. Pulp holds up for 12,000 or 15,000
Yeah.
words, maybe 40 if you're pushing it. Well, military pulp, I call it, which Kindle Unlimited does a lot of. And it's just, you read it, and when you're done, you're going to read another one, but it's sort of like reaching into the popcorn at the movie again. It's not, you're not remembering what you just read so much as I want to feel that way again.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. And that's one thing that's great about, we'll take the last few minutes here on Writers of the Future itself, the short stories, because Jody does an amazing job. And the testament this year was the judges telling me, like, I've never had so much trouble picking a winner. They're all so good. And all the stories, the winning story was like only 1 or 2 points ahead of everybody else. It was that good. And that's something that you get with Writers of the Future.
She commented that the one she thought was probably going to win didn't, but she's not surprised at the one that won, and she wasn't disappointed that it was one of the 5. She'd have been happy if any of them won.
Yeah.
And she'd never said that before. The quality of stories is good.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean when you're first starting, write it in. There are at least 2 people down there that have done less than half a dozen stories ever, and their story caught. And I've known authors that I've talked to at the session that it was their second story ever. They were just inspired. And if you've got a little wit and a little talent, it can work.
Which is also a testament to what pulp fiction is. So it's not literary fiction. It's not something you go through and like, why'd they use this word instead of that word, and et cetera, et cetera. It's story. It's about story. So if somebody's inspired and they just have this amazing story, people are really interested in story, and they'll forgive certain editorial blunders for the sake of story.
We call it literary candy. The fun of it overwhelms any other problems, and you ignore the fact there's no nutrition value. You just read it and enjoy it.
Yeah. And so that's what we've got here. And we intentionally don't have stories that are trying to push an agenda. That if somebody's got that, it's not going to see print in Writers of the Future. It's middle school on up. It's like PG, and it's just really good storytelling with no specific story type line.
Which doesn't mean it can't be intense. We have people
sure.
dying in several of these stories. They're very emotional, very strong, very intense stories. It's just, I think it was Mark Twain who said that if you need obscenity, you're not writing good enough. And if your story is flawed, but it's good, you'll get a runner-up and you'll get a letter from Jody.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe your next story will win, or you'll rewrite it and send it in again.
That's right. And
that has happened several times with winners.
Yeah, absolutely. So the punchline to that is submit, submit, submit. The worst that can happen is you'll get a letter saying, thank you very much, submitting, submit again. But the best that could happen is that you just got a major launch to what potentially will be a very successful career.
If L. Ron Hubbard, who left this in his will and was kind enough to start this whole process, could come back 20 years later and look at where the first winners were. Brandon Sanderson, Eric Flint, all of these amazing finalists who became big names in our field, I think he'd be impressed with himself. He'd have said, wow, I did something really good. And it's consistent now for 40 years that this is it's certainly not the only route, but it is a great kickstart, a great step up for talented people, and people outside our industry recognize that. When I was a Writers of the Future finalist on a submission to a magazine, they'll read it. They won't just skip it.
Yeah, and we did, before everybody came out, we did let's just do a review. I think we're at 64% winners go on to, a career in either writing or art. So, but anyway, our time is up, and I'm glad we're able to talk about your book. And again, the book is called Never Again by Bill Fawcett, available on Amazon right now. It's both as an ebook, print book, and audiobook. And I read it, and it's everything that he said. And for me, it always gives me a chill when I read this stuff. You're like, wow, that really could happen, because those are real people. Even though they're fictional characters, they're real people.
Books are about people. And if you don't have real characters and you don't care about your character, it's not worth writing. And I care about my characters. And I also have to admit I wrote it because it's so much fun beating over our enemies.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you.
And thank you for listening. Subscribe to the Writers of the Future podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We've also been syndicated on the United Public Radio Network, where you can find these podcasts as well. Writers of the Future series can be purchased wherever books are sold in the U.S., Canada, the UK, Australia, and South Africa, and available everywhere via Amazon.com. We're especially appreciative of our sponsor, Carnation, for supporting this podcast. Carnation was introduced in 1899, and 2024 marks its 125th birthday. So Carnation has been making delicious milk products for 1.25 centuries and is still going strong. Writers and Illustrators of the Future are contests created by L. Ron Hubbard to provide a means for the aspiring writer and artist to be seen and acknowledged for 4 decades. It is free to enter and open to amateur short story writers and artists of science fiction or fantasy. Again, thank you very much, Bill.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Outer Realm with Michelle DeRoche and Amelia Pisano. Airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.